My sister's husband used me as free labor for years and called me replaceable until I showed him how easily his business could collapse without me. The phone didn't buzz anymore. For the first time in years, there were no late requests, no rushed questions, no clipped messages asking if I could just handle one more thing. The silence felt unnatural at first, like a sound that had been playing in the background for so long my mind didn't know how to exist without it. I sat alone, staring at the screen, waiting for something that never came. What replayed instead was a sentence. Not shouted, not thrown like an insult. Said calmly, almost lazily, as if it were a fact everyone in the room already accepted. You're replaceable. He'd leaned back when he said it, comfortable, confident, certain of his position. No anger in his voice. No threat. Just dismissal. That word followed me everywhere after. It echoed in quiet rooms, in long drives, in moments where I should have felt relief. It was heavier than any argument because it carried belief behind it. He hadn't said it to hurt me. He said it because he meant it. Because in his mind, my effort, my time, my years of unpaid work were interchangeable parts. Something he could swap out without consequence. I didn't respond that day. I nodded like I always had. I left without making a scene, without defending myself, without correcting him. Rage stayed contained, pressed down beneath something colder and clearer. I understood then that nothing I said in that moment would matter. Words wouldn't change how little he valued what I'd given. Silence was the only honest answer left. Now, weeks later, the business he once spoke about with pride was unraveling. Missed deadlines, confused clients, systems failing in small, quiet ways that added up fast. The momentum he'd bragged about stalled, then slipped backward. People started asking questions he didn't have answers for. The confidence drained from his voice when he spoke to others, replaced by strain. I watched it happen from a distance. I didn't step in. I didn't offer fixes or suggestions. I didn't announce my absence or explain my withdrawal. I simply stopped being there. What collapsed wasn't held together by leadership or vision. It had been propped up by labor no one bothered to acknowledge. Sitting there with my phone dark and still, I felt something unexpected settle in. Not satisfaction, not revenge, recognition. The power I'd given away for years hadn't disappeared. It had just been invisible while I kept offering it freely. Once removed, its absence spoke louder than I ever had. That word, replaceable, no longer echoed with the same weight. It sounded hollow now, detached from reality. The damage had already been done, but not to me. The structure he built on assumption instead of respect was giving way under its own arrogance. I didn't walk away in anger. I didn't plan a collapse out of spite. I simply stopped holding something together that was never mine to carry alone. The rest followed naturally. Looking back, I can see how the structure of our family made this situation feel normal long before it ever felt wrong. My sister had always been the one who smoothed things over. She avoided tension, hated raised voices, and believed harmony mattered more than fairness. If something felt uncomfortable, her instinct was to absorb it quietly so no one else had to. That habit didn't start with her marriage, but it followed her into it. Her husband stepped easily into the role of authority. He liked being seen as self-made, decisive, the kind of man who built something from nothing through sheer will. People praised his drive, his confidence, his refusal to rely on anyone. What they didn't see was how much of that image depended on unseen effort happening behind the scenes. He spoke like everything was earned alone, even when it wasn't. I fit neatly into the space they left open. I was reliable. I showed up early. I stayed late. I solved problems without being asked and fixed mistakes before anyone noticed. If something needed doing, I handled it. Not because I was ordered to, but because I was expected to. Help wasn't framed as work. It was described as loyalty, family responsibility, support. The language made it feel personal instead of transactional. Over time, that framing blurred the edges of what was reasonable. Hours stretched, tasks multiplied, requests stopped sounding like favors and started sounding like assumptions. There was always an unspoken expectation that I would step in, that I would carry weight without needing acknowledgement. Saying no felt like betrayal rather than a boundary. My sister rarely questioned it. She thanked me, sometimes quietly, sometimes with relief in her eyes, but she never challenged the imbalance. Keeping peace meant not rocking the structure that kept everything running. If I hesitated, she reminded me how much pressure he was under, how temporary the situation was, how important it was to stick together. That's how exploitation settled in without announcing itself. It didn't arrive as cruelty. It grew out of familiarity and obligation. Each small compromise made the next one easier. Each unspoken agreement tightened the expectation that I would continue. Leaving earlier would have required seeing this dynamic clearly, and for a long time, I couldn't. It felt like family. It felt like duty. It felt like the role I had always played, dependable and unnoticed. By the time the cost became visible, the imbalance had already been normalized. Walking away wasn't just stepping out of a business arrangement. It meant stepping out of a version of myself that had been shaped to serve everyone else first. At the beginning, it didn't look like work. It sounded like a favor. The business was new, fragile, still finding its footing, and my brother-in-law spoke about it with the kind of nervous excitement that makes people want to help. He framed everything as temporary, a short stretch of effort until things leveled out. I believed him because I wanted to. I trusted his confidence and the way he talked about the future like it was already guaranteed. The first requests were small and almost apologetic. A weekend here, an evening there. Could I take a look at something after my regular job, just to give him another set of eyes? Could I help organize a few things so he could focus on growth? There was always a reason that sounded reasonable. There was always a promise that it wouldn't be like this for long. Money never came up, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt awkward to mention. He didn't ask outright, and I didn't push. Instead, gratitude filled the space where payment should have been. He thanked me often in the beginning, loudly and publicly, calling me a lifesaver, saying he couldn't have done it without me. That praise felt good. It made the time feel meaningful instead of extracted. I told myself it was an investment in family, not a transaction. I took pride in being useful, in knowing my effort mattered during a critical phase. When exhaustion crept in, I brushed it aside by reminding myself this was helping someone I cared about build something from the ground up. Sacrifice felt noble when framed that way. Each favor blended into the next without a clear dividing line. What started as occasional support quietly became expectation. The work expanded, but the language around it stayed soft. There was always appreciation, always reassurance, but never a concrete shift toward balance. I didn't notice the change because it happened slowly, wrapped in trust and optimism. Looking back, that was the moment the pattern locked in. By accepting gratitude instead of compensation, I unknowingly agreed to a role that had no limits. The manipulation didn't feel like pressure. It felt like belief. And by the time I realized how much I was giving, the idea of stepping back felt harder than continuing forward. What had once been occasional help slowly hardened into expectation. The hours stretched first. A late night turned into several. Weekends disappeared without discussion. If something went wrong, I was the first call. If something needed improvement, it landed on my plate by default. There was no formal shift, no conversation marking the change. It just became understood that I would be there. The work itself grew heavier and more complex. I started handling things that had nothing to do with my original skill set. Logistics, scheduling, troubleshooting, client communication, internal systems. I wasn't just assisting anymore. I was keeping the operation upright. When problems arose, they came to me quietly, as if it was obvious I would know what to do. When solutions worked, the credit moved upward and outward, away from where the effort lived. As the business expanded, so did my involvement. Growth brought more responsibility, not relief. Each milestone created new demands rather than space. The irony wasn't lost on me. The more successful things became, the less my contribution was acknowledged. Success was treated like proof that the system worked as designed, not that someone was holding it together behind the scenes. Payment still never entered the conversation. It felt too late to introduce it without sounding petty or disloyal. Gratitude had thinned into assumption. Thank yous became rare. Requests came faster and with less explanation. I told myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, the balance would return. That promise lingered just out of reach, always pushed a little further ahead. I grew tired in ways that didn't show easily. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was the constant alertness, the pressure of being relied on without being respected. I swallowed resentment because naming it felt disruptive. I didn't want to be the problem. I didn't want to create tension in the family or jeopardize what had already been built. Over time, something else shifted quietly. My sense of identity narrowed. I was valued most when I was useful. Conversations centered on what needed fixing next. My presence was tied to productivity, not connection. When I imagined stepping back, guilt rose immediately, followed by fear. What would happen if I wasn't there? What would that say about me? The dependency became clear only in hindsight. The business didn't just benefit from my work. It leaned on it. Processes existed in my head. Relationships ran through my inbox. Stability depended on my availability. Yet none of that was named. Acknowledgement would have required admitting reliance, and reliance didn't fit the image he wanted to project. So I stayed. I kept going. I told myself endurance was strength. I convinced myself this was just how things worked. But beneath that reasoning, something hardened. The resentment I never spoke grew heavier with every unrecognized hour. And with each passing month, the cost of leaving felt higher, even as the cost of staying quietly consumed me. Over time, the way he talked about my involvement shifted in subtle but cutting ways. In front of others, my work was reduced to jokes. I was helping out, as if everything I did happened in spare moments rather than consuming entire weeks. He'd laugh and say I was just good at staying busy, that I liked having something to do. The tone made it sound voluntary, almost recreational, instead of essential. When people praised the business, he accepted it easily. He spoke about long nights and hard choices, about building something from nothing. My role was either glossed over or mentioned briefly, framed as casual support anyone could have offered. If someone pressed for details, he'd wave it off with humor, turning responsibility into a punchline. Laughter closed the subject before it could turn serious. That humor did more than entertain. It deflected accountability. By keeping everything light, he avoided acknowledging how dependent the operation had become. Any attempt to clarify or correct would have made me look uptight, unable to take a joke. The room always followed his lead, smiling, nodding, moving on. My absence from the narrative became part of the story. Privately, the frustration built. Each minimized comment landed heavier than the last because it erased effort in real time. I'd hear my work summarized in a sentence that barely resembled reality, and I'd swallow the urge to speak. Challenging him publicly would have created conflict, something I'd been conditioned to avoid. So I stayed quiet, even as the resentment sharpened. The worst part wasn't the credit he took. It was the way he reframed my contribution as insignificant while continuing to rely on it completely. I was invisible when recognition was given and indispensable when problems appeared. That contradiction sat unresolved, creating a constant tension I carried alone. Those moments taught me how dismissal can function without aggression. There was no shouting, no direct insult, just a steady pattern of erasure wrapped in charm. Each joke reinforced the idea that my labor didn't count enough to name, even as the business leaned on it daily. Standing there, listening to my role reduced to a laugh, I felt myself disappear in small increments. Not because I lacked value, but because acknowledging that value would have disrupted the image he worked hard to protect. And in that space between what I gave and what he admitted, the damage quietly took root. My sister saw everything. She saw how often I showed up, how late I stayed, how my time slowly stopped being mine. She heard the jokes, noticed the assumptions, understood the imbalance even if she never named it out loud. There were moments when our eyes met across a room after one of his comments, and I could tell she recognized what was happening. That recognition, however, never turned into action. Instead, she chose calm over confrontation. When I hinted at being overwhelmed, she asked me to hold on a little longer. When I questioned whether things were fair, she reminded me how stressed he was, how much pressure came with running a business. Her answers always pointed toward patience, never change. She framed endurance as kindness and silence as support. I think part of her believed things would eventually even out on their own. That once the business reached a certain point, gratitude would turn into acknowledgement. Another part of her didn't want to risk tension at home. Addressing the issue would have meant challenging her husband's authority, and that felt more dangerous than letting me absorb the strain quietly. Her loyalty stayed fixed on preserving her marriage. Fairness became secondary, something to revisit later when circumstances were easier. By asking me to wait, she placed the cost of harmony on my shoulders. Each time she did that, I felt myself move further outside the circle of protection family is supposed to offer. What hurt most wasn't that she disagreed with me. It was that she avoided choosing at all. Her silence created space for the imbalance to continue unchecked. I wasn't attacked directly, but I wasn't defended either. That absence spoke louder than any argument. I felt alone in a way that surprised me. I wasn't just dealing with exploitation from one person. I was carrying the realization that someone who knew me deeply was willing to let it happen to keep her own world stable. The abandonment wasn't loud or dramatic. It arrived quietly, wrapped in reassurance, and left me standing on my own without ever being told that's where I'd been placed. As the business gained traction, the shift was impossible to ignore. Money started coming in steadily. Clients returned, then referred others. The name he'd worked so hard to promote began circulating with respect. Conversations changed tone. Stress was replaced with confidence, and confidence turned into pride. From the outside, it looked like a success story unfolding exactly as planned. Inside, nothing changed for me. My workload stayed heavy, sometimes heavier than before. Growth brought complexity, and complexity landed squarely in my hands. Systems needed refining. Processes needed oversight. When something broke under expansion, I fixed it. When deadlines tightened, I absorbed the pressure. The business was no longer fragile, yet my position remained just as undefined as it had been at the start. There were promises, though, always promises. He spoke about the future like a guarantee. Once things settled, we'd talk. Once the next phase passed, we'd revisit roles. Once the revenue stabilized, there would be room for adjustments. Each milestone became another reason to wait. Progress was used as justification for postponement rather than correction. That delay created a strange tension inside me. Part of me felt hopeful. Surely now, with success visible, acknowledgement would follow. Surely results would force fairness into the conversation. Another part of me felt increasingly uneasy, watching how easily my contribution was still overlooked even as profits climbed. Both thoughts existed at once, pulling in opposite directions. I struggled with the contradiction. The business thrived in part because of my effort, yet that effort remained unnamed and unpaid. I told myself to be patient, that timing mattered, that pushing too soon might damage relationships. At the same time, every new success without recognition chipped away at my belief that things would ever change on their own. What made it harder was how natural the exploitation began to feel. Success masked imbalance. From the outside, everything looked functional, even admirable. Questioning my place started to feel selfish, almost disloyal, despite the fact that my labor had scaled alongside the business itself. The more it grew, the harder it felt to step back. Hope stretched thin but didn't disappear. I held on to the idea that fairness was coming, that all this effort would eventually be seen for what it was. That belief kept me going longer than it should have. Each promise of later pushed the reckoning further away, even as the cost of waiting quietly continued to rise. The moment itself didn't arrive with drama. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no raised voices. It happened during a small disagreement, the kind that usually ended with me adjusting and moving on. I had questioned a decision that affected the workflow, something I knew would cause problems later. I spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't sound accusatory. I wasn't asking for control, only consideration. He didn't like that. His expression stayed calm, almost bored, as if my concern was an inconvenience rather than a contribution. He listened without interrupting, then smiled slightly and brushed it aside. He told me I was overthinking things. When I pushed again, gently, pointing out what would break if we continued that way, his tone cooled. Not angry. Certain. That's when he said it. Casually. Like a fact everyone already understood. You know you're replaceable, right? The word landed heavier than any insult could have. There was no heat behind it, no effort to wound. That was what made it cut so deep. He believed it. He said it with confidence, like someone stating the weather. In that moment, every late night, every sacrificed weekend, every unspoken favor rearranged itself into a clear picture. I felt something inside me go quiet. Not hurt in the usual way. Not rage. Just clarity. The room felt suddenly distant, like I'd stepped back from myself and was watching the exchange from somewhere safer. I realized he wasn't dismissing an argument. He was dismissing me. He continued talking after that, explaining how businesses adapt, how people come and go, how nothing depended on any one person. I barely heard him. My mind was replaying the word over and over, testing its weight. Replaceable. After years of being the one everything ran through. After building systems no one else understood. After being the solution whenever something failed. What shocked me most was how clean the moment felt. There was no confusion left, no mixed signals, no hope clinging to future promises. The sentence stripped away every illusion I'd been holding on to. I finally understood how he saw me, not as family, not as a partner in effort, but as a resource that could be swapped out when inconvenient. I nodded while he spoke, signaling agreement I no longer felt. Inside, something detached. The loyalty I'd carried out of obligation loosened its grip. The resentment I'd buried stopped needing to hide. In its place came a calm I hadn't expected. He thought he was asserting power. What he didn't realize was that by saying that word out loud, he'd given me something far more valuable than recognition. He'd given me permission to stop pretending. After that word was spoken, something inside me shifted into a different mode. I didn't announce it. I didn't confront him again. I simply stopped trying to be understood. The need to explain myself, to justify my effort, to hope for appreciation faded almost instantly. In its place came distance. Quiet, deliberate distance. I noticed how my reactions changed. Tasks that once triggered stress now felt procedural. I completed what was necessary, nothing more. I stopped anticipating problems before they happened. I let gaps exist instead of filling them automatically. For the first time in years, I allowed silence to sit where I used to rush in with solutions. Emotionally, I pulled back even further. I stopped absorbing his moods, his urgency, his expectations. When he spoke about pressure or deadlines, I listened without internalizing responsibility. The sense of obligation that had driven me for so long lost its grip. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I was observing. That observation brought clarity. I began to see how much depended on my presence, not because I was irreplaceable in theory, but because I had been carrying systems no one else understood. I noticed how often decisions stalled without my input, how quickly confusion spread when I wasn't there to smooth it out. These weren't things I pointed out. I just watched them happen. Control returned in subtle ways. By stepping back internally, I regained choice. I could decide where to apply effort and where to withhold it. I could see leverage without needing to use it yet. The power dynamic shifted not because I demanded change, but because I stopped giving more than was asked. That single word had unlocked something he never intended. It freed me from loyalty built on obligation. It replaced hope with awareness. And in that awareness, I found steadiness. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was paying attention. Once I stepped back emotionally, I started seeing the business with a clarity I'd never allowed myself before. Without the pressure to protect it or prove my worth, the structure revealed itself plainly. I could trace how things moved from start to finish and, more importantly, where they stalled without intervention. Patterns emerged that I'd been too close to notice when I was constantly fixing them in real time. I ran through systems in my head the way you might inventory a room you've lived in for years. Client intake relied on templates I'd created but never documented. Scheduling flowed through a network of informal rules only I followed instinctively. Vendor relationships existed because I remembered preferences, conflicts, and timing without needing reminders. None of this lived in manuals or shared files. It lived in me. The more I examined it, the more fragile it looked. On the surface, everything appeared organized. Beneath that, there were gaps patched by habit rather than design. Decisions were made assuming I'd be there to adjust outcomes afterward. Mistakes were tolerated because I quietly corrected them before they became visible. Stability wasn't built into the business. It was borrowed from my attention. That realization didn't excite me. It sobered me. I understood then that growth hadn't strengthened the foundation. It had stretched it thinner. Expansion multiplied dependence rather than distributing responsibility. The business didn't just benefit from my presence. It assumed it. I noted how little redundancy existed. If I were unavailable, timelines would slip. If I stopped anticipating needs, confusion would follow. If I removed myself entirely, key processes would stall because no one else knew where they lived or how they connected. These weren't threats I planned to make. They were facts I could no longer ignore. With that awareness came detachment. I stopped feeling personally responsible for outcomes beyond my defined role. The urge to rescue faded. Instead of jumping in when something faltered, I watched how long it took for anyone else to notice. Often, the delay was longer than expected. Sometimes, no one noticed at all until consequences appeared. Power showed itself not as dominance, but as understanding. I didn't need to announce what I knew. I didn't need to leverage it aggressively. Simply recognizing the imbalance changed how I stood within it. I wasn't trapped anymore. I was informed. For the first time, I saw the business not as something I owed loyalty to, but as a system balanced precariously on unacknowledged support. That understanding didn't make me cruel. It made me calm. And in that calm, the outcome began to feel less like a risk and more like an inevitability waiting for the right moment. I didn't announce any change. There was no speech, no warning, no emotional confrontation. I simply stopped doing what no one had ever asked me to do out loud. I answered direct questions. I completed specific tasks when they were clearly assigned. Everything else, the invisible work, the anticipatory fixes, the quiet corrections, I let fall away. At first, nothing seemed different. Habits take time to reveal their absence. I showed up when expected, spoke when addressed, delivered exactly what was requested. Nothing more. The absence of extra effort was subtle enough to pass unnoticed, at least initially. From the outside, I still looked cooperative. Inside, I felt steadier than I had in years. Restraint became my anchor. When I saw an issue forming, I didn't rush to intercept it. I waited to see if anyone else would catch it. When deadlines approached with missing pieces, I let the gaps remain visible, not out of spite, but out of accuracy. I was no longer smoothing reality to protect someone else's image. There was a strange calm in that choice. Without the constant pull to overperform, my mind quieted. I stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. I stopped carrying outcomes that weren't mine to own. Each day felt lighter, not because the work disappeared, but because the burden of responsibility finally matched my role. No one accused me of pulling back, at least not right away. The system had grown so used to my silent compensation that it didn't recognize the loss immediately. Confusion appeared in small ways. Delays here, missteps there. I watched without comment, noting how quickly small issues stacked when no one stepped in automatically. That calm was intentional. I wasn't trying to provoke a reaction. I was reclaiming control by respecting my own limits. The power came from consistency, not confrontation. By refusing to overextend, I forced the system to reveal its true shape. In that quiet withdrawal, I felt something solid return to me. Not anger, not revenge, agency. For the first time, my effort aligned with acknowledgement. And in that alignment, I no longer needed to prove anything. The silence did the work for me. The effects didn't arrive all at once. They showed up in small failures that were easy to excuse at first. A deadline slipped by a day. A client asked a question that no one seemed prepared to answer. An internal task stalled because two people assumed the other was handling it. These weren't disasters yet, just inconveniences, the kind that get brushed aside with confidence and noise. I noticed how quickly confusion filled the space I'd vacated. Messages bounced between people without resolution. Instructions contradicted each other. Decisions were delayed because no one wanted to take ownership. Before, I would have stepped in automatically, smoothing things out before they became visible. Now, I watched the process unfold exactly as it was. My brother-in-law reacted the way he always did under pressure. He blamed circumstances first, then vendors, then employees, anyone but the structure itself. His frustration grew louder, more erratic. Meetings ran longer without producing clarity. Problems were discussed repeatedly without being solved. The same issues resurfaced because the underlying gaps were never addressed. What stood out most was how often questions circled back to areas I had quietly managed for years. Someone would ask how something was usually handled. Another would guess incorrectly. The answer was never written down, never formalized. It had lived in routines I maintained without recognition. Without those routines, the system showed its seams. I felt a strange stillness watching it happen. Not pleasure, exactly, but confirmation. This wasn't chaos I created. It was instability that had always existed, temporarily masked by my effort. Seeing it exposed brought a quiet sense of justice, delayed but undeniable. The narrative that I was easily replaced began to fracture under its own weight. He didn't connect the dots right away. Instead, he doubled down on control, tightening his grip where he could. That only made things worse. People grew hesitant, afraid to make mistakes. Initiative dropped. Small errors multiplied. The business started reacting instead of planning, lurching from one issue to the next. Through all of it, I stayed consistent. I did what I was asked, nothing more. When questioned about outcomes beyond my scope, I answered plainly without stepping in to fix them. My calm unsettled him more than anger ever could have. There was no confrontation to latch onto, no emotion to dismiss. Each crack reinforced the same truth. The stability he believed was inherent had been borrowed. Without constant unseen labor, the structure couldn't support its own weight. Watching that reality surface didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel finished. The need to prove my value evaporated, replaced by the certainty that it was already evident to anyone willing to look. The replacement arrived quietly, introduced as a solution rather than a transition. My brother-in-law framed it as growth, as proof the business was evolving beyond reliance on any single person. He spoke with renewed confidence, announcing the hire as someone experienced, capable, ready to take pressure off everyone. The implication was clear without being stated. I had been swapped out. At first, the new person tried hard. Questions came quickly, then more urgently. They lacked context, not skill. They didn't know why certain choices had been made or how exceptions were handled. Procedures that seemed straightforward on paper fell apart in practice because the logic behind them wasn't written anywhere. Each misstep required correction, and each correction cost time. Errors started appearing where none had before. Clients noticed inconsistencies. Timelines slipped again, this time more visibly. Fixes required extra hours, outside consultants, and rushed decisions. Costs climbed in ways no one had anticipated. What had once been quietly efficient became loud and expensive. My brother-in-law grew frustrated, though he directed it carefully. He blamed onboarding, training gaps, the learning curve. He insisted things would smooth out once the new hire settled in. But the mistakes kept coming, not because the person was incapable, but because the system depended on knowledge that couldn't be handed over quickly. It had been built gradually, through years of involvement no resume could replace overnight. Watching this unfold brought an unexpected sense of validation. Not triumph, not bitterness, just confirmation. The word he'd used so casually lost its weight in the face of reality. Replacement wasn't a switch you flipped. It was a process, and that process revealed how much had been underestimated. The business strained under the adjustment. Margins tightened. Stress returned, sharper than before. Meetings grew tense as numbers failed to align with projections. Each attempt to patch the situation exposed another layer of dependency that had never been acknowledged. I stayed on the edges of it all, observing without intervening. No one asked me to step back in. Pride stood in the way. Even as cracks widened, the narrative had to hold. Admitting the mistake would have meant admitting reliance, and that was something my brother-in-law couldn't bring himself to do. The collapse wasn't sudden, but it was inevitable. With every costly error, the truth became harder to deny. I had never been replaceable in the way he meant. Not because I was exceptional, but because the business had been built around my invisible work. And once that was gone, the illusion of stability went with it. The call came after weeks of silence. No apology preceded it. No acknowledgement of what had been said or how things had ended. His voice carried urgency, not humility. He spoke fast, outlining problems as if I were still part of the structure by default. Deadlines were collapsing. Clients were unhappy. Systems weren't working the way they used to. He needed help immediately. What struck me wasn't the request itself, but how it was framed. He didn't ask if I was willing. He assumed availability. The language was transactional and urgent, stripped of any personal reckoning. It sounded less like reaching out to a person and more like calling a tool that hadn't responded as expected. The past didn't exist in that moment, at least not to him. He spoke about the situation as an emergency, something that required setting feelings aside. He emphasized pressure, responsibility, and the potential fallout if things didn't stabilize quickly. There was an expectation that I would step in because I always had. That pattern was so ingrained it didn't occur to him that it might no longer apply. I listened without interrupting, noticing how little had changed in his approach. There was no reflection, no pause to consider my position. Just urgency wrapped in entitlement. He needed the outcome, not the relationship. The distinction felt clear in a way it never had before. Emotionally, I was distant. The panic on his end didn't transfer to me. I felt calm, almost detached, as if the situation belonged to someone else. That distance wasn't coldness. It was clarity. I understood then that helping again would restore the same imbalance, erase the boundary I'd finally set. When he finished speaking, there was a brief silence. I didn't rush to fill it. For the first time, I allowed the weight of his request to sit without reacting. In that pause, The moral lines sharpened. I could see exactly what he wanted and exactly what it would cost me. I declined without drama. No long explanation. No revisiting the past. Just a simple refusal. The reaction on the other end was disbelief, followed by frustration. He pressed again, reframing, insisting. I didn't move. Ending the call, I felt grounded. Not victorious. Not bitter. Certain. His panic revealed what his confidence had hidden. He had never seen me as a partner, only as a function. And once that function was unavailable, the urgency surfaced without reflection. That understanding closed the door quietly, without needing to be slammed. She reached out a few days later, and her tone was softer than his, but no less loaded. She didn't start with what had happened or how things had unfolded. She didn't mention the word he'd used or the years I'd carried more than my share. Instead, she went straight to the result. The business was struggling. Stress was high. Things were falling apart. She needed me to help. She framed it as a family issue, not a personal one. This wasn't about him, she said. It was about stability, about avoiding bigger consequences, about protecting something that affected all of us. Her words were careful, chosen to avoid blame while still applying pressure. She reminded me of shared history, of how much was tied together, of how hard it would be if everything collapsed. What she didn't do was acknowledge the harm. There was no apology on his behalf or her own. No recognition of how I'd been treated or why I'd stepped away. The focus stayed fixed on outcomes, not actions. She spoke as if the past could be bypassed if the present demanded it badly enough. Listening to her, I felt a deep sadness settle in. Not anger, not disappointment, just the quiet grief of realizing she still prioritized keeping things intact over making them right. Even now, fairness felt secondary to convenience. My role was still being framed as a solution rather than a person. I told her I couldn't do it. I said it calmly, without explanation beyond what was necessary. She tried again, shifting the appeal, emphasizing unity, obligation, sacrifice. Each word was familiar. Each one echoed the reasons I'd stayed silent for so long. This time, I didn't bend. Holding that boundary hurt more than I expected, but it also felt clean. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was choosing myself. Ending the call, I understood that this was the final test. And by refusing to step back into the same pattern, I passed it. Saying no didn't require the build-up I once would have given it. There was no rehearsed speech, no careful layering of reasons meant to soften the refusal. When the moment came, I answered plainly. My voice stayed even. I didn't raise past grievances or outline sacrifices. I didn't argue my worth or defend my choice. I simply declined. That simplicity carried weight. Without anger or explanation, there was nothing for them to push against. No opening for debate. No detail to challenge or reframe. The absence of justification made the boundary solid in a way words never had before. I wasn't asking to be understood. I was stating a decision. On the other end, there was confusion. Silence stretched longer than expected, as if they were waiting for the rest of the sentence. It never came. They tried prompting me, asking why, suggesting alternatives, offering compromises. Each attempt assumed I still owed clarity or negotiation. I didn't provide it. What surprised me was how calm I felt holding that line. In the past, refusing would have triggered guilt, a rush to explain myself into exhaustion. This time, there was no need. My choice didn't require permission. It didn't need validation. It stood on its own. That restraint shifted the balance. By not defending myself, I reclaimed authority over my time and energy. The conversation ended not because it was resolved, but because there was nowhere left to go. When I hung up, the quiet felt different from before. It wasn't heavy. It was clean. Walking away from the expectation to explain was an act of self-respect I hadn't practiced before. I realized then that power doesn't always come from asserting more. Sometimes it comes from saying less and meaning it. The collapse didn't arrive with drama or headlines. It unfolded in quiet withdrawals, one decision at a time, until the structure that once looked solid simply couldn't hold its shape anymore. Clients started leaving first, not in a rush, but in a slow, steady trickle. Long-time accounts stopped renewing without explanation. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed, then canceled. Each departure weakened the foundation just enough to make the next loss easier. Cash problems followed quickly. Payments that used to arrive like clockwork began coming late, then not at all. Bills stacked up in ways they never had before. Small expenses suddenly mattered. Choices that once felt automatic required discussion, then arguments. The confidence that had fueled every conversation drained away, replaced by urgency and blame. Nothing catastrophic happened in a single day, yet everything slipped out of reach all the same. The damage extended beyond numbers. Word traveled faster than expected. Vendors talked. Former partners compared notes. Mistakes made by replacements spread confusion instead of efficiency. Deadlines were missed. Promises went unfulfilled. Trust eroded where reliability once lived. Reputation, built slowly over years, unraveled in weeks once consistency disappeared. No one needed to attack it. Neglect did the work on its own. What struck me most was the absence of recovery. There was no pivot that saved it, no late realization that reversed momentum. Every attempted fix came too late or addressed the wrong problem. Efforts focused on appearances instead of structure, quick patches instead of real understanding. Without the knowledge that had been taken for granted, the operation couldn't stabilize. It kept reacting rather than adapting. I watched all of this from a distance I had never been allowed before. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, only recognition. Consequences had arrived without my involvement, shaped by choices that weren't mine. I hadn't pulled anything apart. I had simply stopped holding it together. Requests for help became rarer as options disappeared. The tone shifted from urgency to resignation. Conversations stopped mentioning growth and turned toward survival, then quietly ended altogether. The business that once demanded my time without acknowledgement no longer required anything from me at all. That ending felt different than I imagined it would. There was no celebration, no revenge, no moment where I needed to say, "I told you so." Justice didn't come through confrontation. It arrived through alignment. Effort had been extracted without respect, and once that effort was gone, the imbalance revealed itself fully. In the end, the collapse wasn't cruel. It was proportional. What failed wasn't the company alone, but the belief that people can be used indefinitely without cost. When that illusion broke, everything built on top of it followed. The story they began telling afterward didn't match what actually happened. It started subtly, with small comments dropped into conversations that I wasn't part of. I heard later that he had been saying I walked away without warning, that I left him exposed at the worst possible moment. The word abandoned showed up more than once, carefully chosen to shift weight off his choices and onto my absence. There was no mention of years given freely, no acknowledgement of how much had been taken without return. Just a clean, simple version where I became the villain by default. My sister tried to smooth the edges of that version. She didn't fully accuse, but she reframed. She said things like it was all a misunderstanding, that stress made everyone act out of character, that nobody meant harm. Her tone was gentle, almost apologetic, but the direction stayed the same. The focus was never on what led up to the collapse, only on how uncomfortable things felt afterward. Pain was acknowledged in general terms, never assigned responsibility. Pressure followed in familiar ways. Calls framed as concern carried expectations underneath. Messages asked me to see it from his side, to remember family, to avoid holding grudges. Each attempt tried to shrink what happened into something manageable, something that could be dismissed if I were just more flexible. The pattern was clear once I stepped back. If history could be rewritten, accountability could disappear with it. What surprised me was how little any of it reached me emotionally. The words landed, but they didn't stick. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself or correct the record. Detachment had already done its work. I knew what I had given, what I had endured, and why I stopped. No revised version could change that internal clarity. That distance created safety. Not the loud kind that comes from confrontation, but the quiet kind that comes from certainty. I no longer needed agreement to feel grounded. Their narrative could shift as much as it wanted. I wasn't living inside it anymore, and that made all the difference. Life after usefulness didn't arrive as a dramatic reinvention. It came together slowly, through ordinary choices that added up to something solid. I found work where my time had a clear value, where effort was measured, acknowledged, and exchanged fairly. There were contracts, schedules, expectations written down instead of implied. For the first time in years, I knew exactly what was being asked of me and what I would receive in return. The difference showed up in small ways at first. I stopped feeling tense before opening messages. Evenings belonged to me again. Rest no longer came with guilt attached. My energy went into projects that didn't assume endless availability or silent sacrifice. When a request crossed a line, I said no without rehearsing explanations in my head. Nothing collapsed when I did. In fact, things became simpler. Boundaries reshaped every part of my routine. I chose when to help instead of being pulled into obligation. I learned that generosity works best when it isn't demanded. Relationships adjusted naturally once expectations were clear. Some people drifted away, others stayed, but none relied on me disappearing inside their needs. That balance felt unfamiliar at first, then steady. There was no urge to prove anything to anyone. I didn't talk about the past unless asked, and even then, only in broad strokes. Healing didn't require a spotlight. It required consistency. Showing up for myself the same way I had shown up for others for so long changed how I moved through the world. What surprised me most was how quiet self-worth can be. It doesn't announce itself or ask for validation. It settles in through routine, through respect earned and given equally. I wasn't needed in the old way anymore, and that turned out to be a relief, not a loss. My life didn't depend on being useful to survive. It depended on being whole. That word stayed with me longer than the collapse itself. Replaceable. He said it like a fact, not an insult, as if it explained everything. At the time, it felt sharp, dismissive, meant to shrink me into something small and temporary. But distance has a way of stripping words down to their truth, and over time I understood what he was really doing. He wasn't naming my worth. He was defending his certainty that I would stay no matter how I was treated. What I see now is that the word was never about me at all. It was projection, clean and simple. He needed to believe I could be swapped out easily because the alternative was frightening. If I wasn't interchangeable, then his success wasn't self-contained. If I mattered, then he owed something he never planned to give. Calling me disposable allowed him to avoid that reckoning. Value is strange that way. When it's present, it fades into the background. Systems run smoothly. Problems don't surface. Effort disappears into results, and those results get credited elsewhere. Only when the support is gone does its shape become visible. Only in absence does contribution finally get named, though usually too late to matter. My work was invisible because it functioned. Once it stopped, everything built on it was exposed. I didn't need to announce my worth or demand recognition for it to exist. Removing myself did more than any argument ever could. It clarified roles, revealed dependencies, and showed exactly how much had been taken for granted. The collapse wasn't an act of revenge. It was a mirror held up to a structure that relied on denial to survive. What brings me peace now is the certainty that leaving wasn't a loss. Staying would have been. I didn't walk away to punish anyone. I stepped back to protect myself. That distinction matters. One is driven by anger. The other is guided by clarity. I chose clarity. I no longer react to how the story is told without me in it. Words lose their power when you understand why they were used. Being called replaceable only hurt when I believed it. Once I stopped accepting that framing, it became meaningless noise from someone afraid of what my absence proved. He called me replaceable because he thought I wouldn't leave. He was wrong.